So, in the previous lecture, we started discussing environmental criminology, and we covered Cornish and Clark and Cohen and Felsen. This lecture is about environmental criminology, but we're looking at architecture to create defensible spaces and prevent crime. So, the first theory we're going to talk about is Oscar Newman's defensible space. I strongly recommend you look in your textbook at the images that Newman provides around how to make public housing more secure. In this particular article, he's writing about a community in Brooklyn. He says that using his theory of defensible space, we can increase security, increase visual surveillance, provide a reinforcing mutual benefit, and enhance territorial attitudes. What he means by territorial attitudes is he wants people to feel invested in their neighborhood, in their home, which means that they will take action to prevent people from harming their neighborhood. So in Newman's defensible space, he describes four elements that must be considered when we are designing neighborhoods and buildings and homes. So the first one is territoriality. He describes that we want a very clear sense of those spaces that are private and those that are public. It should be clear about how a space should be used, who should use it, and when to use the space. So if you remember Gran Torino, Clint Eastwood was very adamant about the use of his neighborhood. He was incredibly territorial about how that neighborhood was used. I mean, not as you don't want to probably bring out a shotgun, but Newman is talking about that kind of territoriality. And you can differentiate between private and public space using multiple methods. You can do it so via trees, or you can do so via fences. You also want to increase natural surveillance. This is the same element that is listed in the situational crime prevention techniques. You want to increase surveillance, but not via cameras or police. You want natural surveillance. You want residents, agents, right? People to be able to see what is going on in their neighborhood, which means you don't want very tall trees blocking the windows. You want the trees to be just at the window because you want people to be able to see out, to see what kind of havoc is happening in their community, and you want people to see in to your home in case there is a burglary or some type of violent crime occurring. Image is the third one. You want to maintain an image that your neighborhood is cared for, that it is not isolated. So when there's, for example, litter on your lawn, you should be picking that up. Even if you live in an apartment building, this is linked almost as much to broken windows theory, right? You want to remove the disorder. The difference between Newman and Wilson and Kelling is that Wilson and Kelling argue that the police should be out there on the streets protecting the image of a community. But Newman and crime prevention through environmental design as a whole explain that you want the people to maintain the image of its community. And the final element to consider for defensible spaces is milieu. This is the location of any home or any other property. You want to reduce the amount of places near alleys or near highways. Obviously, that's not possible, so you want to beautify those areas as much as possible to make it seem less risky by enhancing the image. I hope those four make sense, and if they do not, please email me or use the Q&A. Now, Crow and Zom are two other theorists who wrote Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, which we know as CPTED. And they make a very similar argument to Newman. They describe how through the proper design and effective use of land, you can reduce fear and incidence of crime. And they explain that we can actually identify which approach is best for which location, which activity. So they look at three design approaches. First is natural access control. I want to highlight that number 1 and number 2 are both have the word natural in them. That means that this isn't formal access control or formal surveillance, right? This isn't the use of fences or security cameras, right? It's the use of nature. So using your trees, using bushes. So you want natural access control. You want to use bushes and trees to designate the difference between private and public space. You want to limit access to intruders. Natural surveillance. You want front porches and back porches on a property. You want a front porch because individuals can sit on the porch and see what's going on in the neighborhood. And then you want a back porch so you can see what's going on in the homes behind you or the streets behind you. You also want a lot of windows, a lot of lighting, and you want to use landscaping to increase the view you have around your property. Finally, you want territorial behavior. This is also similar. So you can see there's two characteristics here that are very similar to Newman's defensible space. Territorial behavior has to do with ownership of your property, a stake, right? You want to have a stake in your sidewalks. And the use of porches actually increase this because when you're sitting on the porch, you are much more aware of how that space is used. And often people care much more about how that space appears. So Crow and Zom describe that, of course, you can have natural, organized, or mechanical, right? So natural is always the one you want first, right? Just to iterate, you want to use nature and you want to have the people of the community become the surveyors. Organized is when you have guards, right? So you have like your security patrol people driving around. And then mechanical, obviously, is when you have cameras. You want to always implement natural techniques before you move to the organized and the mechanical. So they describe that by implementing CPTED, you can provide a very clear border of controlled space, public space, private space. You can increase surveillance. You can reduce fear of crime and actually improve communication in that community. So the next theorist is Jane Jacobs. If you remember, we talked about Jane Jacobs before. Jane Jacobs gave that famous quote in her critique of broken windows theory, right? That no amount of police can enforce civilization where the normal, casual enforcement of it has broken down. She's making the same argument here that social disorganization theorists made, Felsen and Clark, Crow and Zom, and Newman are also making, that you want to have people invested in their communities. In her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she describes that American cities are collapsing and that the goal is to feel safe and secure among strangers. As we move to the suburbs, just like Cohen and Felsen described in their routine activity theory, she argues that it's become much harder for us to identify strangers. She explains that the community must enforce its own standards and must impose its own means of control. And so she writes in one of the chapters in her book called Sidewalk Safety, Eyes on the Street, she explains every community should have these three elements. And these three elements will increase safety, reduce fear, and increase security, particularly among strangers. So first is natural surveillance, which we've covered before. And she makes the same argument that situational crime prevention makes and CPTED makes. The idea is you want to have eyes on the street. You want people to be able to see what's going on in their community and make an effort to prevent it or intervene when something bad is going to happen. She says you can increase natural surveillance by providing continuous sidewalk activity. You want people to use the streets. By using the streets, you have more contact with others who are using that street. Finally, you want a mixture of commercial and residential spaces. The Lower East Side of New York City is a prime example of this. The idea is during the day, when the people who live in the apartment upstairs, actually 2nd Street of Long Beach is a really good example of this as well. So what you have when you mix commercial and residential space is that you often have the commercial space on the bottom floor, on street level, and then you have the residential space on the upper floors. And you can see this on 2nd Street in Long Beach. But the Lower East Side of Manhattan, actually most of Manhattan also has this kind of design. So during the day, the residents in the apartments above or the condos above will go out to work, which we know increases target suitability because no one is home. But if you have commercial space on the 1st floor, then you know that that storekeeper will be able to make sure that your home is protected. Now at night, when the store is closed, you now have the residents who are there to observe and keep an eye on the store below. So Jacobs explains that this is a form that by using these 3 techniques, natural surveillance, continuous sidewalk activity, mixture of commercial and residential space, you can have self-government of a community. The community will be able to know the strangers, know the residents, and have an effective way to handle people who don't belong. Now, of course, there are some criticisms of environmental criminology. So what we see is that let's say we have a very high crime around auto theft happening in one area. And so then we increase some technique. So some people put clubs on their cars. Then we will actually see crime decrease for auto thefts. But it won't ever get to 0. And in fact, it eventually goes back up again. Why do you think? Well, those offenders eventually figure out other methods of stealing cars. And the reason why that is we never address motivation. We will always have people who seek to commit crime because we're not reducing the motivation for offending. The next criticism has to do with financial resources. Not every community, not every individual is able to implement CPTED or situational crime prevention techniques. Those techniques can be very expensive. Landscape, redesigning properties, or implementing a variety of alarms or other security mechanisms is not cheap. And so what happens is that middle class and upper class communities are able to protect themselves while the lower class communities, and actually when you look at crime patterns, most crime happens in those lower class communities. The third one is victim blaming. By not focusing on the offender, we are focusing on the target, on the victim, and we're placing more blame on the victim for what happened to them. Why didn't you lock your car door? Why didn't you have an alarm system? Why didn't you have a better security system? Why did you walk down that street? Versus, why did this person do that? It puts a lot of ownership on the victim. The final criticism is a fortress society. Using particularly mechanical mechanisms, you can imagine all of those who can afford it to live in a fortress society. Essentially, they will be living in castles with moats around their homes to protect themselves from these likely offenders. We've already armed ourselves much more so now than we've had in the past. We own over 200 million guns, over 18 million defensive sprays, dogs, we have alarm systems. We can see over $10 billion in alarm sales. While Felsen describes how political criminological theory is, I think he neglects how a particular method of crime prevention actually benefits the whole security market. And so while environmental criminology has some very significant benefits, we should probably be careful at placing too much blame on victims or living in such a state of fear that all those who can afford it protect themselves through living in castles with moats and gates. So that's environmental criminology. If you have any questions, always go to the Q&A. I'm really interested in looking at your images that you'll provide for the discussion board. Also, there are some great images of defensible space and septed that I provide for you. So see if you can identify which of the elements that those particular images represent. On your final exam, those images will be questions asking you what those images represent. Do they represent territoriality? Do they represent natural surveillance, etc.?